Welcome. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center. The whacker next to me is Kathryn Stoner, the director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And together with the Hoover Institution, we're delighted to sponsor the Rethinking European Development and Security speaker series. And our first speaker of 2025 is the fantastic Yoshiko Herrera, who is a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A preeminent scholar of political identity. Okay, I'm going to lead. Okay. She is a preeminent scholar of identity and the construction of institutional and personal identities, and the author of two books, Imagined Economies, The Sources of Russian Regionalism, and Mirrors of the Economy, National Accounts and International Norms in Russia and Beyond. She's written extensively about political economy, post-communist politics, ethnicity and language, and most recently about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so today we're delighted to welcome her as she presents her work entitled Identities and War, where we can learn from Russia's war in Ukraine. Welcome, Yoshiko.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. And there's a couple more seats up here if anybody's still looking for seats. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. I just want to note this is a picture actually from Irpin from 2023 that I took, and it's a school that was bombed and then has been repainted with Ukraine's symbol of sunflowers by either by Banksy or a person purporting to be Banksy. So it's just a little symbol of what's happening there. A lot of rebuilding, but some of the things are still as they were. Okay, so a motivating. Oh, I see I'm a little bit blocking. Oh, okay. So a motivating question for me since 2022, which maybe some of you share, was why did Russia invade Ukraine? That's, I think, what was on people's minds at the start of the war. And some of the answers to that we have a better sense of now. And some of those answers have to do with identity, which led me to thinking more about this question more comprehensively. So I think one of the answers for why Russia invaded Ukraine has to do with Russia's imperial ambitions. That is to recreate the Russian Empire. And I think the core, most important aspect of this imperial ambition is the denial of Ukrainian nationhood and the denial of Ukrainian sovereignty. And connected to that sort of expansion of Russian global power. Another factor, I think, in the invasion is the Russian national identity within Russia. And as Russia watchers know, there's been both an emphasis on the humiliation of the 1990s, the expansion of NATO seen as a sign of Russian weakness. I think that it's most important not in the actual threat that NATO posed to Russia, but in terms of NATO expansion being a symbol of Russian weakness. And also this obsessive cult of World War II and the Russian victory over fascism, which in the Russian telling is about stopping the invasion of Russia. So the Holocaust, things like that are very peripheral to the story of World War II for Russian nationalists, and it's more about the attack on the Soviet Union and on Russia. And then I don't want to suggest that identity is the only answer. This is a picture of Putin meeting with his economic advisors the first week of the war, obviously very tuned into what they had to say. And this is actually an interesting thing, the long tables. That was something new that started in recent years. But I think the miscalculations that Russia thought its previous military victories in Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, Syria, they thought that Ukrainians wouldn't resist, which I also think is related to the imperial gaze of just not taking Ukraine seriously, and thinking that the US and Europe would not care or would be divided, connected with these other identity factors. So what I took from this, I mean, just general thinking about the war, about what happened, was a couple of things. One is that ethnicity per se is not really what matters in this war. There's other aspects of identity that mattered, and also that identity is working in conjunction with other factors. So this led me to a wider explanation of the connection between identity and conflict and identity and war that was kind of sparked by this war and this invasion, but tried to think a little bit more broadly about it. So what I'm going to present today is this work on how identity is related to conflict, but mixed in with some examples from the war. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of where we're going here, I think that identity can help us understand conflict or war in a couple of different ways. One is related to the causes of war in terms of the motivations, in terms of intergroup relations or who you think are your friends or enemies. And also importantly, and this is one of my topics that I've worked on for a long time, which is the way that identity connects to the interpretation of information. And that's about how you see the past, how you understand what happened, how you make sense of the world. The second aspect that I think identity is important for is in terms of the conduct of the war, the ability to mobilize people to fight, the behavior of troops during the war, and also the general support for the war effort in different countries. So I think these two areas are two ways that identity is important. And also, I think this war is showing that, and there's other work on this as well, that war can change identities as well. So identity can be a variable explaining some of these things, but different kinds of identities are also a consequence of wars. Okay, I have a couple of preliminary things before talking about those aspects. And one is that I just want to note that this seems very obvious, but it's a really, I feel, very important point. There's different kinds of identities. There's ethnicity, there's national identity, there's religious identity, there's, organizations have identities, corporate identity, there's gender, etc. There's different kinds of identities. And this is often lost in the conflation of everything with ethnicity. So this is one point, is that there's a lot of different kinds of identities. Second, if we're looking at an explanation, where the locus of the decision making is very important. So is it a personal individual decision? That's sometimes what we look at in terms of elites. A lot of IR scholarship focuses on personal identities. Or are we talking about mass identities, national identity, et cetera? And so this is also, I think, it's kind of a basic point, but if you're looking at identity as a variable, then you want to think about the level or unit of analysis. And that's gonna matter in terms of where we focus on. And just these pictures, I have this picture there of President Zelensky. These are soldiers with the Z marked on the tank, and then also this is a ceremony marking the beginning of the school year in Moscow in 2023. We see the small boys marching, flags, etc. So I think where we would look depends on what it is we're trying to explain. And one other preliminary is ethnicity is not always, maybe I should have said not always the answer. I think there's just an over focus on ethnicity still, even almost 3 years into this war, overemphasis on looking at ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, but not just in this war, but around the world, that people focus a bit too much on ethnicity. And this is not a really new point, but it's just something I felt like the war needs to emphasize, that really going back over the last 20, 25 years of scholarship, as I said earlier, ethnicity is not the same as other identities. People have worked a lot on this topic. Jim Farron, a lot of work on measuring identity, on data sets on different kinds of identities. And still, I think there's still a reversion to talk about things as ethnic identity. Even something like the Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq, like, it's not an ethnic identity. That's kind of important to understand. Also, as I said, I think the Ukraine case shows the limits of ethnicity. And another point that I feel is just a preliminary point, is very important, is that there's a lot of contestation and differences within groups. in fact, I think there's more contestation within groups, and which group it is really matters. So just to give an example, a pretty important book called Co-Ethnicity by Habyarimana et al. Colleagues that looked at the way that ethnicity or co-ethnicity led to cooperation. It was a series of experiments, very, very well done. But actually, if you look at the book, you find that they don't find that co-ethnics actually cooperate that much more than with people with other groups. And I think this is more common than you might think. In some work that I've done, co-authored work with Andrew Kidd on identity and formal models, you can have a model of a group and figure out different things that happen within the group. But when you apply that model empirically, you see that actually people don't just trust people part of their ethnic group more than others. They don't necessarily rely on somebody who's part of their ethnic group than another. You might think they do, but when you actually look at a lot of experimental work, you see that it doesn't work out empirically as much as we might think theoretically. And I think one reason is that the relevant group for people might not be the ethnic group. Another thing is about scale, that people tend to rely on friends, family, people they know, people who they trust for some reason, who might share their ethnicity, but it doesn't mean they rely on any random person who shares their ethnicity for the same things. So I think the focus on contestation and differences within groups is just a critical factor in studying the effects of identity. And then finally, I just want to note, I think it's now shown in the literature very well that it's not about ethnicity versus material interests or ethnicity versus rationality or things like that. It's that people make decisions, strategic decisions in the context of these identities. And I think that this war, where the strategic miscalculations on the part of the Russians are very important to how the war has gone, are also made in conjunction with these identity factors. Okay, but let me go through now some of the ways in which identity does help us understand conflict. This is a picture of Dmitry Medvedev at a conference for school kids on geography in Sochi in March 2024, where he put up a map behind him of what he sees as the Russian of this area, which is interesting for different reasons. One, Moldova is prominent there. Romania gets a bit of territory back. Kiev is allowed to exist as a little bit, and then Russia is getting the rest. I think that one way to think about identity-based motivation for war that's well-trod ground is the classic nationalism. That there's an ethnic group, they're discriminated against for some reason. They get sick of that. They want to have their own state. So this classic idea of nationalism, kind of 19th century idea, is out there, and sometimes there's evidence for that in different places. But there's also a lot more work on not the formation of the state to begin with, but once you have a state, national identity of the state being important to different kinds of decisions that states make. And again, like this is has to do with a different understanding of the nation, etc., that goes often beyond ethnic or religious identities per se. And there are also other socially constructed identities that don't necessarily fit so well into the nation-state framework. So, for example, work on the Crusades and the role of the Catholic Church. And also, I would say Putin's approach to rebuilding the Russian Empire is not really that easily fit into a classic understanding of nationalism. And where that's coming from, how widely it's shared in society, I think is just much more complicated. It's clear that he and his minions have literal minions have ideas about what Russia should be, but in terms of how that fits into our general understandings of nationalism, national identity, I think it's a little bit more complicated. A second way of thinking about identity and war is about the assessment of who are your friends and who are your enemies. I think, again, like there's a lot of work on social identity theory. It's probably the most widely studied paradigm of identity in social sciences. And there's a lot of evidence that says just having an identity, so in-group, in-group love, doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. It may lead to group distinction, doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. But something I think is very important is what actually is the in-group? And I just think there's too much reversion to people thinking in the large groups, ethnicity, national identity, et cetera, as that's your in-group. It might be your in-group, but when you think of just America, you think, how much do we have in common with people of a shared ethnicity? And I'd say, you know, the polarization between Democrats and Republicans suggests that white identity is not particularly coherent in terms of us versus them. There's just a lot of contestation. And so we have to kind of go beyond the existence of groups to understand how having one group identity leads to views towards others. And there's actually so much work on this, as I have found, a lot of work on who you should be in alliances with, how the global order may entail management of diversity of different kinds of groups, including racial distinctions globally, et cetera, that these kinds of assessments can inform who you think are part of your group or not part of your group. Lots on threat assessment having to do with identity commitments that you might have, or who you think another state is, if they're part of your identity group, they're not. You may assess some kind of objective situation more in a more friendly or more threatening way. And finally, there's just so much work on status and power hierarchies, which are, I think, really important in international relations and not easily corralled into ethnicity or national identity, et cetera. And it kind of goes back to my point about what is the group, because status power hierarchies can be based on different kinds of things. And some things are a bit vague and not as easily, you know, apparent, and take a little bit of searching. I have the map there of the waves of NATO enlargement, and it's kind of interesting to think about what those countries have in common or don't have in common. I mean, some ways you might say they have a lot in common. Other ways you might think, well, there's certain conflicts or disagreements, et cetera, that aren't so easily solved. And I mean, I think it's interesting to think about whether NATO, what kind of alliance it is. Is it an alliance based on any kind of shared identity, or is it a much more strategic kind of material consideration of power, et cetera, versus identity? I think there's some mixed views, but I think, anyways, any identity is one of the ways to think about how people group different states. A third thing, which is something that I'm very interested in, is related to the identity-based interpretation of information. And I think that this is a more relevant topic now, where people see so much disinformation or blatantly wrong information that is believed by people. There's lots of work on collective memories and how those inform the future. And I have this picture here of the Holodomor Memorial in Kyiv, which is a very important event for Ukrainian nationalists. And it's something that I think is an example of something where you can see some systematic differences across identity groups. People who are Ukrainian, no Ukrainian is going to say, I have no idea what that is. I've never heard of it. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's something that even today, still in Russia and other parts of the some of the states of the former Soviet Union, the discussion of famines or deaths or displacement, deportations, et cetera, is thought about and remembered very differently depending on different groups. And those collective memories then inform people's ideas about what they're seeing today. And this, it could be, you could think about this in collective memories, narratives, motivated reasoning, explanations for past events. I have a recent paper in with Andy Kidd on refusal to apologize or repent because you don't see what happened as similar. You don't agree on who is to blame. So you just don't fundamentally agree on who is to blame. In that paper, we focused on Tiananmen and U.S. versus China interpretations of what happened there. And I would say still, even today, there isn't an agreement. Yes, we agree. These are the facts. These are the things that happened. And this is who is to blame. There's lots of historical events where there remains widespread disagreement, or deep disagreement, not widespread, deep disagreement among parties over what happened and who is to blame. But that paper actually focuses on getting over that, despite disagreement over the past. So sometimes countries can come around to working together, and I think actually Russia and China are cases of that, where they've had a lot of disagreements in the past, and they're working together now, but not because they've agreed on every single thing that's happened in the past. And I would say, in general, with Russia's recent history, the likelihood of either the current Russian government or a government similar to the current Russian government coming to terms with even the last 20 or 30 years of saying, like, these are all the things that happened, we admit to doing this, that, and the other. I think the likelihood of that is extremely low. Like, they are just not going to, they're not likely to agree on what happened nor to apologize. And yet there still may be reasons to have to cooperate or work together on certain things despite that disagreement. But one of the reasons we argue for the refusal to see things the same way can be identity related, in that having a specific interpretation of an event can be constitutive of what it means to be part of that group. So if you're Armenian, you're not going to say, like, I don't know, maybe there was a genocide, maybe there wasn't. That's a constituent part of your identity to understand that, with the caveat that sometimes there's disagreement. Okay, just moving on. I think identity and the conduct of war is another area of research. People looking at who signs up to fight, why certain people agree to be part of the army, to mobilize, etc. Have looked at identity networks. I actually think this is maybe even relevant in Russia today. If you look at Tuvins and Buryats and others and why they have signed up. Some people say, oh, it's just anybody that's poor will sign up. But I think the pattern of mobilization is more, is not so evenly spread, and there may be some other reasons. So I think identity networks, and I'm just citing some work from other countries, that has to do with what people, who people know and what others are doing. I think an interesting thing is that in-groups can share information, and Jay Lyle has a paper on insurgency and counterinsurgency in the Second Chechen War, arguing that Chechens were better counterinsurgents than non-Chechens because they were more able to find Chechen insurgents. But the reason is not because of a shared ethnicity, like some genetic predisposition to be better at insurgency or counterinsurgency, but just that this shared identity meant they had better understandings of how they behaved, what was a way to convince people, how to get information from relatives, etc. So actually, in this case, in groups were better able to get information about norms, about shared norms as being part of that group. So I think that's a way in which identity informs the way that a war can unfold. Identity can also affect the behavior during war for combatants. There's just a lot of writing now about the poor performance, bad behavior, war crimes, so criminal behavior of Russian troops being not just an anomaly and not just about some troops, but being about the culture of the Russian military and the lack of reform over the years in the Russian military, and the way that what they think is appropriate or inappropriate. That's one of the ways that identity can affect the conduct of war. And then finally, which is a really big area of research, is the domestic support for war. And that, again, brings in national identity and how that's related to decision making. But I think it goes beyond national identity to thinking about what people think is appropriate, how they follow decisions, etc. So the upper picture there is a picture of body exhumations in Bucha in Ukraine, and that I think everybody knows about those massacres. The picture on the half-cut picture on that side are teachers in Voronezh who were pranked by a Belarusian guy who sent them a directive saying, you need to make tinfoil hats put them on your heads, get some flags, take a picture of yourself. The hats will protect you from like cosmic ray guns or something from Ukrainians, and make pictures and videos of yourself and send them in. And so they did. And okay, it's on the one hand, it's a practical joke, but it's also interesting that people would take that absurd directive and do it. And why would they do it? And I really recommend, if anybody hasn't yet read this book by Elena Kostachenko, horribly titled "I Love Russia." However, it's a great book about what's happening in Russia. She's a journalist for Novaya Gazeta, and she recently wrote this book. She also, if you listen to This American Life, she was one of the journalists profiled, because she was poisoned in Munich, presumably by Russian agents. Very brave woman. It's a comprehensive book looking at different aspects of Russia, what's happened in different places, and it gives a much broader picture of the, not just despair, but the inclination towards following directives from above, and the corruption and the normative conception of what it means to be decent. And in her telling, what it means to be decent is to not complain, to not say something is wrong, to not fight for your rights, but just to like stay home and be quiet. So I think it's a very interesting portrait of how the country has been working over the last 24 years, and how that leads to a picture like that of those teachers. Okay. Finally, I want to just note two more things, and one is about the consequences of war, and identity as an outcome. So I tried to talk about different ways that identity can affect conflict, but also identities are affected also by wars. There's decent amount of work on this in different places, that having certain kinds of experiences affect you. Going back to that Holodomor example, of course, like some kind of traumatic or violent event is something obviously people might remember, Cato famine, etc., that has long-reaching consequences. But there's also another interesting way to think about identity in post-war context, though, is about the creation of identities that cross pre-existing war boundaries. So post-war national identities. Actually, my colleague Eiley Tripp did a lot of work on gender and war, and about the changes in gender norms post-war. So there's ways in which wars can not just have a negative effect, but can maybe be the cause of a potential different kind of collective national identity, or changes in gender norms, etc. It's also, I think, interesting to think about, going back to the connection between identity and strategic choices, that wars or conflicts sometimes lead people to have to make consequential choices about one side or another, etc., that then can have longer term effects. And then just finally, this example of the abduction of Ukrainian children, which is now in the official counts around 20,000 children, forced deportation. This is a literal remaking of identity by taking all these children from occupied areas of Ukraine, sending them into Russia. And again, I recommend the Kostachenko book, which one of the chapters deals with orphanages, another with mental hospitals, etc., in terms of the just horrific conditions of people in Russia in orphanage. And Russia has still one of the highest levels of children in orphanages of any country in the world, and that's pre-war. That's just like a matter of a Soviet legacy. And so the remaking of Ukrainian children into Russians is another aspect that I think deserves attention. So I think that, in terms of thinking about identity in war, there's the ways in which identity affects conflict, but also how it comes back. And I want to just end with a little bit of data on the what's happening in Ukraine in terms of national identity, and some figures that I think are particularly striking. So first is a chart. This is data from Rating Group going from 2012 up until 2023. And the first chart is asking people what language do you speak at home? So the orange is Ukrainian and the blue is in Russian. So you can see that in 2012, 37% of people in this survey said they spoke Ukrainian. I'm sorry, reversed it. The orange is Russian and the blue is Ukrainian. So 37% said they spoke Russian at home, and that is down to 12%. Now, maybe people are saying that to pollsters, et cetera, but it's a striking change. And if you talk to people from 1991 or even 2000, like the most ardent Ukrainian nationalists, and you said, like, how can we get the number of people speaking Ukrainian at home to reach 60%? It's like, you can't get people to do things like that. I mean, people are just going to do what they're doing. You can't get people to change, but you can see a fairly dramatic change there. Another thing that I think is very interesting, and like, I guess, like kind of a deeper social science perspective of like, what does it mean? Is they ask people, what is your native tongue or what is your native language? Now, most people would not change this answer over time. They would say, whatever it is I was speaking as a kid, or maybe the language I'm supposed to speak because my parents spoke to me in that, but I don't really want to speak it. Okay, so I have a native language, but it just, that's what my native language is, and then you stick with that your whole life, whether you speak it or not. Some people don't like that question on surveys, on censuses, for example, because they say it mixes in national identity, ethnic identity, language use. It's kind of a mixture of things. That's true. It's also, for that reason, I think actually kind of an interesting and good measure of national identity, because people are choosing that. And you can see that from 57% of people saying Ukrainian was their native tongue in 2012 to 82% now. It's a quite striking difference in people thinking about what should be their language, which is maybe connected to their actual language use. Another set of polls I think that's very relevant to international relations more generally is about EU membership and support for NATO membership. And from 2005, there was only 34% of people in favor of joining the EU in Ukraine. And remember, 2005, that's after 2004, Orange Revolution, et cetera. Still, only 34% in favor. It did go up after the Orange Revolution, but now it's in the 90% in terms of EU membership. Again, like, it's a massive shift in what people think, which community they think they should be part of. And similarly for NATO membership, the support went from 16% up to 86%, which is, you know, maybe needs pointing out, the precise opposite of Putin's goals in terms of controlling Ukraine and keeping Ukraine in the Russian orbit. The war starting with 2014, takeover of Crimea, and then this full-scale invasion has pushed Ukrainians precisely the opposite way. Now, there was some separation as some people who were pro-Russian moved into Russia post-2014, but nevertheless, what you have left in Ukraine are people that are very much interested in being part of NATO and part of the EU, more so than ever in their history as an independent state since 1991. Okay, and just to wrap up, I think this is going to be, I think, an important part of the history of this war is the level of domestic support in Ukraine, the will to fight, the will to maintain their nation and state has created a fairly unified sense of national identity across ethnic groups, Ukrainian, Russian, Crimean Tatar, etc., cross-religious, cross-regional. I think there's lots of data now that shows that the sense of national identity is much more unified. This is a picture of a veteran cemetery in Lviv, and you can, this actually is from the summer. It's very heartbreaking to see the just detailed, loving care that people put towards their loved ones who were killed, and you go through it, and it's really heartbreaking. But you can see there's a lot of there's often pictures, and you can see different kinds of people, and you see different kinds of people at the cemeteries. And I think the mobilization of civil society in Ukraine has been really extraordinary in terms of the war effort. And I think that is also going to be related to this more unified sense of national identity, and not to overly romanticize it because it's very, very costly. But I think that there is a clear sense of commitment to maintaining a state and nation in Ukraine that's only gotten stronger with the war rather than weaker. Okay, so just to conclude, I think that identity can be important to explanations for the causes, conduct, and consequences of war. But ethnicity is not the only approach, or even in some cases, the most likely variable. Identity can influence motivations and goals, assessment of allies and threats, and interpretation of information. And identity networks can affect the mobilization to fight. Norms, I think, are very important in the conduct of war. And national identities, social identities, different kinds of identities can affect support for the war effort. And so from that sense, identity can be both an independent and a dependent variable. In my opinion, for Russia, the imperial and Russian national identity were really important factors in starting the war and in its genocidal conduct of the war, and to some extent in the support for the war as well. And on the Ukrainian side, I think the war has transformed national identity in ways that were never imagined by some of the most ardent nationalists. This picture up above is a picture of the statue at the Ukrainian World War II Memorial in Kiev. And this one is the Funny Combination Museum. It's a museum called the Territory of Terror Museum in Lviv, which was the train depot point for deportation of Jews to Auschwitz and other places in Lviv. And so part of the museum is about the not so nice history of Ukrainians in World War II, but it's combined with a resting place for Soviet statues as well. So it combines these things. And one of the things that's so interesting and striking about the museum is they have a whole room of pictures. You see somebody's picture on the wall, and it tells you a little bit of a description about them. Like, Luba, she lived in this city, and she was a teacher or something. So first you see that, but then you open a little book, and it tells you what she did. Maybe she was deported. Maybe she was a collaborator. Maybe she was a police person rounding up people. Maybe she did different things, and you don't know. And just by looking at people and seeing their names, you don't know who is a friend, who is an enemy, who is doing what. You have to see what choices the individuals made in this larger effort. And I think it's a good reminder of the different choices that people make in the context of war, and how, even though I'm trying to suggest that identities are very important, it's also within the context of people making individual choices. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Yoey. So our practice is that I handle questions after Anna does the stellar introduction. So if you just indicate, as Alex is showing here, your interest, I will keep a list. Okay, Alex, go ahead. And if you could introduce yourself as well. I think I have to pass the microphone.
Do we have to pass the microphone?
Okay, go ahead, Alex.
Okay, I can project. I'm Alex Merkizat-Rudnicki. I'm a CDDRL postdoctoral fellow. Really interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I was curious if you could talk a bit about war's effects on supranational identities in relation to this conflict. So I was in Germany at the time that the invasion started, and I recall a very strong sense that Germans thought of Ukrainians as Europeans, which I don't know would have been I think surprised many people that there was this very strong activation of this supranational and identity and sort of a changing of the boundaries in relation to this war. And I'm curious about whether you've looked at that and how you think about that. And then also as a Ukrainian Canadian, about the extent to which you also see these dynamics in kind of diasporic communities, of which there are of course many for this group. And so I'm sort of curious about some of the kind of other IR dimensions of these effects of war on these identities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't looked specifically at the effect of war on transnational or global identities, but I think that's definitely a good point. I mean, my kind of overall point is that some kind of event or experience can change your assessment. You know, people learn, they update about whether another person is trustworthy or whether they're friend or foe, etc. So you could imagine that at the global level as well. I think something that's kind of interesting about identity is that sometimes we think of it as slow changing and sticky, but I think war is the kind of event that could lead to more dramatic changes. So in terms of thinking about institutional change, you have like gradual institutional change, and then you have some kind of crisis or something that could cause a more radical shift. And so I guess I would think of it in that way, that that the war could have some shifts. I mean, I think actually, for example, just the relationship between Ukraine and Poland is very interesting and wasn't always so great. So that is definitely shifted, and I would be surprised if post-war there wasn't a different relationship between Poland and Ukraine, and also actually the role of the more recent NATO members in the eastern part of Europe in terms of their role and leadership in NATO and other international institutions. I think that's another area that could change.
Okay, we are getting a longer and longer list, but we have time. We have 30 minutes. So Jim Fearon, you're next.
So, wondering if you could say a little bit about obviously you're totally right about Gelner and but Anderson wrote this chapter called Official Nationalism about how monarchs were driven in this nationalism to kind of legitimate their stable position after the worldwide spread of sovereignty ideas. And I mean, maybe you can't sort it out, but what's your sense for, how much is this an instrumental strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect question. Okay, one could go back and find instances where the Russian state has done specific things like change textbooks, reduce non-Russian native language instruction, different things. And you could write a sort of linear chapter of like everything has worked up to this point. Like ever since 2000, they have done these things to emphasize Russian national identity and to de-emphasize or lower the status of non-Russian people. You could do that. But you could also go back and see all the times they tried things and then they stopped them because they didn't work, or the contradictory moments. So for example, the anti-migrant campaign, they had these anti-migrant campaigns that then led to like massive riots in Moscow. And they said, oh, forget that, like end of the anti-migrant campaign. Interestingly, there is a current anti-migrant campaign going on, I would say, for the last 3+ years. And that's in the context of 1 million Russians having left the country, of needing people for the war effort, of having massive need for employment. So the unemployment level is very low. So you would think if they were strategic, they would not be kicking migrants out. They would not be hassling Central Asians, et cetera. They would be using those people in the war effort. If you look at Putin's own statements, he never says directly, I am a Russian nationalist. I hate all non-Russians. He never says that. He says things like, Russia, everybody knows, is a multi-ethnic country. Anybody who uses the slogan "Russia for Russians" is, an idiot or they're compromised. So he makes those statements saying, I accept there's this diversity, et cetera. And yet the policies of the textbooks, of the education, et cetera, are going a certain way. So I think there is, now you could say, well, he's just a super genius and this is this 3-dimensional chess and he's doing all these things purposely. But my sense is that there is some contradiction because they try out different things and they see what happens. And when something goes wrong, they just cut it off. But some things they let go, and it's not clear why they let it go for so long. So I don't understand the current anti-migrant campaign and how that's going to play out. So I think there's kind of a mix. However, in the last, let's say, since 2020, and I think historians like Serhiy Plokhy and others who have looked at this, to look at is Putin serious about this Russian empire, about Ukraine not existing as a state? I think a lot of people have come around to saying he is serious about that. That's not just an instrumental use of nationalism for something else. He actually means that. So I think there is some evidence, especially since 2020, that his views have changed. And then somebody like Eugene Finkel's book, Intent to Destroy, is kind of a long, it's very good, comprehensive documentation of episodes when Russia has tried to destroy Ukraine as a nation. And so that, I think there's mixed evidence on, there's certain kinds of consistent areas, but there's some things that don't make a lot of sense. So I'm not sure.
All right. So I would imagine some of the anti-Central Asian as well is specifically about terrorism, right? And focus, as it might be an excuse, but okay, Jim Goldgeier, next on the list.
I'm curious to hear you extend your analysis on identity to prospects for negotiations and potential impact of negotiations. In terms of the prospects on both sides, maybe your thoughts about the way Putin has articulated Russian national identity. There are a lot of people who argue that that's why he's not interested in negotiations. Here's your thought on that. And then also, in terms of the strengthening of Ukrainian national identity, what it would mean for President Zelensky to engage in negotiations, particularly loss of Ukrainian territory as part of that. And then if there were negotiations and there was some kind of negotiated settlement, what do you think that could potentially mean for these identities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm like, I was going to say hesitant, but like a little bit scared to answer in this room with a lot of people that work on these kind of topics. I think that typically, if you think you're winning, you don't want to negotiate. So I think Russians right now, Putin thinks they're winning, and objectively, they are making important gains, unfortunately. And I think they know they're going to be worse in the future, even though a person like myself has been saying for 3 years the economy is in bad shape in Russia. Like, it is in bad shape. And I can't see that they think next year will be stronger than we are today. Like, we're making gains today, and so we want to keep going. So just from a military perspective, separating out the identity, I think the Russian side would want to like keep making gains as much as they can while they can, anticipating that if there were a ceasefire that allowed either Ukrainian membership in NATO or European troops or anybody that's seriously going to patrol a border and stop Russia, which would mean using lethal force if Russia broke it, that would be a disaster in some ways for Russia, because they would have allowed this 80% of Ukraine to exist as a strong anti-Russian state. So I think that it's, I don't know, there's a level of like, what could you call a win or what could you call a loss? I happen to think the way that the Russian government manipulates media, public opinion, etc., I don't think they must keep fighting for domestic legitimacy. I think they have the ability to, they've had multiple off-ramps and they have the ability to just say, if they wanted to. I mean, so many governments face economic crises that they don't have the levers to change. And this is a case where we've driven our economy into the ground, but we could actually solve it all tomorrow by stopping the war. We could just stop the war, try to get rid of the sanctions and change things around. So they actually have the ability to improve their country dramatically by making that decision. But why wouldn't they? And I do think they're committed to some extent to establishing control over not just Ukraine, but over the other former Soviet states. So Maria Popova and Oksana Shevel argued that essentially if Ukraine had just gone along with Russia, there wouldn't have been a war. And to the extent that other former Soviet states go along with Russia, Putin is not interested in invading them. So if you're a Belarus, et cetera. But if you go against Russia, that's where the problems lie. So that makes Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, et cetera, particularly problematic. So I think that there is an identity component to not wanting Ukraine to exist as a nation, but there's another, I guess I would say, larger imperial focus of just generally wanting to have control. But it's not necessarily up to Russia to decide that. I think on the Ukrainian side, they want, I mean, this is my sense, is that there is a very strong commitment to maintaining nationhood and statehood of Ukraine as a state. So any kind of let Ukraine be back part of Russia is not feasible from a societal or from an elite point of view, because you couldn't operate as an elite that way. But I think that now, because of the costs, you know, whereas questions of letting go of some territory earlier might have been politically not feasible, I think that's changing a bit in the current context.
So I'm just going to inject myself for a second, because I noticed in all of that, you did not mention the word democracy or wanting to be part of Europe as a part of Russia, as though it doesn't matter to Ukrainian identity or their reasons for fighting back. So can you link that up a bit?
I have a slide on.
We did not rehearse this in advance. This is spontaneous.
No, I took it out just for time, but I actually, and I'm kind of like blocked by the little thing. I actually think, you know, it's interesting to look at these, okay, even in America or other democracies, to look at who says democracy is preferable to any other government. And it's one of the effects of the war is that it has brought Ukrainians into much stronger belief about the need for democracy. And I think when you have this corrupt empire on the other side of you trying to kill you, it changes your views on what kind of government you should have over, you know, how much corruption is allowable when people are dying because of corruption. So I think that the support for democracy is not just like, as a general matter, we like democracy, but the way that a country is governed has like consequential effects on your everyday life. And so I think it's been very important within Ukraine that shift. I also think I agree with Maria Popova on this, that the focus on Ukrainian corruption, I now think, I feel I'm a little bit of a conspiracy, like I feel a Russian conspiracy everywhere, but this focus on Ukraine being corrupt, I think is not the correct focus for our attention in terms of governance and things in Ukraine, and especially post 2014. So I think thinking about ways that they have strengthened democracy, ways that they have decentralized and strengthened civil society, et cetera, that should be a focus of attention, and potentially could be a model for other countries. But yeah, I think the commitment to democracy and being part of Europe is a very important change that's happened in Ukraine. And that's another reason, aside from the mass violence, for why Ukrainians wouldn't want to accept living under Russian control.
Right. What are we not Russian? What are we not willing to live in an autocracy? Okay, Dennis Morozov.
My name is Dennis Morozov. I'm the question that I have. Can you say a few words about the role of the religion in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that was an under-researched topic in the first 10 years or so of the Putin regime. How, if you look at where the Orthodox Church was in 1991, where it was in, let's say, 2011, like a dramatic turn of events. And I think it didn't seem particularly threatening, I would say, in the 90s. The, you know, restoration of churches is like, it's like a little side, you know, cultural thing that people are doing. But the Orthodox Church became like a very important partner with Putin in terms of the legitimation of, I would say, this status hierarchy of Russian dominance, and also a way to exert control over other Orthodox countries, including Ukraine. But now there's some interesting, you know, distinction between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, and I don't have the polling data on this, although Oksana Shevel has worked on this. But
you presented it here, right where you're standing.
Okay.
Yep.
But yeah, that shift in people in Ukraine towards the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, away from the Russian Orthodox Church, I think is another example of the way in which the war has made changes in people's understanding of religion that would have been hard to predict, you know, without the war. So I think the Russian Orthodox Church is currently, you know, just working directly with the Kremlin, and that, from a religious point, you might think is delegitimizing, although we see in other countries that some religious organizations work hand in hand with dictatorships, and it doesn't necessarily hurt their hurt their standing among apparently religious people.
I don't know what you're referring to. Just joking there. Okay. Who do I have here? Oh, yes.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm an MIT student here. And my question is more, if you have experience with this, about data collection, and I was wondering how feasible or how easy or difficult it is to get this kind of data in Ukraine now or in the past, since the invasion. So that's one question. And then I was wondering, how might the data differ based on who responds? Or like, are there sort of differences on things like
Yeah, that's a really good question. So generally in Ukraine, there's surveys going on all the time on identity issues. Volodymyr Kulik is, I think, one of the leading people doing these kinds of surveys. But are they doing surveys in areas that are currently evacuated or, in Mariupol? No. Are they doing them in Crimea now? No. So to some extent, some people would say, okay, these surveys are based on basically pro-Ukrainian people, Ukrainian nationalists more in the West versus the whole country. And so the change over time is because of not asking people in the East where there is fighting. I think that's a fair point. But I also think a lot of the surveys are done by phone or by internet. And so they still, all surveys are problematic in the current age because young people don't want to answer the phone. Telephone service could be cut off. Mail could be disrupted. So there could be like general issues related to survey non-response. But it's obviously going to be worse in the eastern areas. So I think it's an important thing for people to pay attention to. But I don't think I would be surprised if after the war is over, that the results are not in the direction that we're seeing. I mean, it might be a bit different, but I would be surprised. But that's speculation on my part. But it's a good question.
Okay, Whiting.
My name is Weizen. I'm a visiting fellow from National University of Singapore. I thank you for your presentation. Your presentation presumes the nation state. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this identity in the pre-nation state phase as a legacy in the post-nation state phase. The example in my mind is China. Was an election. Chinese and Japanese used to purchase their ID card just for the sake of convenience. Right. And that's still the case. As we can see in the tension between China and Hong Kong, the rich people will think, well, identity is just an instrument. Determined by business opportunity or wealth. So of course this has an implication on the immigration policy, like the wartime comes, how immigrants choose their.
Yeah, I think. Well, you have a lot of good questions there. So first on like identity in the absence of a nation state. I think there's like a decent amount of constructivist scholarship on a mixture of things. You have elites, identity entrepreneurs, people who get the idea that we want to have our own state. They can mobilize people sometimes for different reasons. I mean, Hong Kong, I think, is a good example of, is there a Hong Konger identity in formation? But then it's been cracked down upon by China. If it hadn't been, maybe that would have developed. So I think that there's always these things going on, and it's a good example of the ongoing process of contestation. I mean, Kurds would be another case with the current Syria of like what's going to happen there. Like maybe this is an opportunity for development of a Kurdish state that would take not just the existence of an identity, but take some elites or action by people to create the infrastructure for a state, etc. But in terms of individuals making choices, I think this is I think Ukraine is a really interesting case here because a lot of people I think this change over what is your native tongue is example of people making these choices of saying like who they are, who they're not. And people always have a lot of different things. Well, many people have, let me just say, many people have potential choices that they could make about their identities. And they choose to go one direction or another as a matter of different kinds of incentives. It could be some economic incentives. It could be cultural reawakening. It could be different kinds of things. And I think those things are often going on in different places. And there can be some boundaries that once you make a certain choice, you can't go back to another. So I think that process is going on currently in Ukraine with people in the diaspora and people within Ukraine having to make choices. Or sometimes, the people being deported to Russia generally are, if you look at these horrible disasters of hurricane, fire, et cetera, and you see who doesn't leave or who leaves, et cetera, like people who are old, poor, infirm, middle-aged, who are taking care of older disabled people often don't have a lot of options to move someplace else. They stay somewhere until the last minute, and then they're going to get on the bus that comes. And if the bus that comes is the bus going to Russia, they end up in Russia. So you could say they chose, but you could also say they didn't have a lot of choices because of their situation. And then they end up, someplace in Russia. And now what is their choice that they have? So sometimes it's choices, but in a constrained way.
Okay, Mike McFall, and then gentleman there. But first, Michael.
So Mike McFall, Stanford, great talk. I basically just want to ask Jim Fearon's question again, if I'm allowed, but with a couple of more nuances on two different sides, both on the, the production of what I would call disinformation from Putin, and then it's the long-term effects. So on the argument of the enemy, has it changed over time? So, and I'm asking because, if you look at what Putin said at the beginning of the war, and I've heard Putin personally say this, he thinks that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. Mm-hmm. So in that identity, why are we slaughtering ethnic Russians, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought he had this argument about denazification and the West and all that. But it seems like I'm not an expert. I used to follow this stuff. I don't follow it anymore. But you do.
You are an expert.
I used to be. I want to emphasize that. But has it changed over time? And because how do you continue to slaughter these people that you originally said are just Ukrainian, are just Russians with accents? And by the way, on the ethnic piece, as you know better than I, they slaughtered ethnic Russians as well. So did it change over time or not? Or are they still kind of connected to that denazification? It's the bad, Zelensky, he's bad Russian with accent, Ukrainian with accent, but all the other Ukrainians will eventually join us. It seems to me you can't keep fighting for 3 years and sustain that argument, but I could be wrong. And the second is related about what you said about stickiness of these things. And the data, I was trying to look it up, but, and I want to parrot, obviously, as everybody who follows Russia knows, all data about Russian attitudes is really bad, and we know that, and we can talk about that if we need to. But I think IRI did a poll right before, I don't know if they published it, but they did a poll right before the war, and there was very little support for the war against Ukraine, right? Like it was even an abstract thing. Obviously, those numbers changed overnight, in the ways that you were talking about before. How sticky are those? Will that be the same 20 years from now? And what argument of the enemy is the one that's going to be around in 20 years? Is it going to be NATO, or is it going to be ethnic Ukrainians?
Mm-hmm. Okay, those are good questions. I think on the protection of Russians versus killing of Russians, something that's interesting is Russia, aside from Syria, since 1991, all of their military action has been in the former Soviet space, which I think is interesting in terms of where their actual commitments are. Syria was one case. Beyond that,
Libya.
Syria. Well, agreeing to Libya, but not. But anyways, like a lot of their action has been in the former Soviet space, and they have often used the explanation of protecting ethnic Russians. Even though in times when ethnic Russians have called for their support, they have not come to their aid. They actually use the argument. I I wrote an article with the Chechen scholar Murat Ilyasov comparing the Chechen wars to Ukraine war. And they actually used the argument of protecting ethnic Russians also in that conflict. But interestingly, in the Chechen conflict, there's no belief that Chechens are actually Russians, you know, with an accent. So I think the Ukrainian case is different in terms of the real and deep denial of Ukrainian nation, which I think is more widespread much more widespread than just Putin, and very different from some other ethnic groups. I mean, in terms of non-Russians, I think there isn't just Russian and non-Russian. There's different kinds of non-Russians. So there's Ukrainians who are bad Russians. They're apostates. If they would do the right thing, we wouldn't have to do this. Why did you make me do this kind of argument? You know, there's foreigners. Chechens are not considered the same as Tatars or as you know, Yakuts or Buryats. Like there's different understandings of these different groups and how dangerous they are. So I think that the Ukrainian case is a bit different from some of the others. It might be close to Belarus in terms of we're actually the same people, but the problem with the Ukrainians is they're doing this wrong thing to us by trying to join Europe, trying to join NATO, et cetera, and that's why they deserve to be punished. I'm amazed that not only is Putin been able to kill ethnic Russians, Russian speakers in eastern part of Ukraine, but also the estimates of 700,000 or 800,000 casualties from this war just go without any comment. In December, I highly recommend a podcast called Ukraine, the Latest from the Daily Telegraph. I listen to it every single day. And they were talking about, it's a very good podcast. It's a kind of update of the war, but also just other cultural and interesting things. Over 2,000 casualties a day. I mean, that's just crazy. And just
on the Russian side.
On the Russian side, 2,000 casualties a day, being very incremental. Killed, missing, and wounded. Yes. But just to let that go and have no comment on that, the people being killed in villages in small towns in Russia. I mean, if you have a village of 700 people, I mean, that's significant if you're losing even a couple people, right? People would know those people. So I think this is like an amazing aspect of the war, that level of cost in terms of human life, not to mention the Ukrainian side, is just going without commentary for the moment. Now, how will that be? You know, will the war end and they just never talk about it? I don't know. I mean, I do not expect this kind of regime to come to terms with it openly, but it is an amazing aspect of the war that they are killing ethnic Russians, they're killing their own soldiers or wounding, and then, okay, not to mention, what is it like to be a disabled person in Russia? And the shame also of coming back wounded. This is not going to be a place where they're going out of their way to help wounded soldiers. I mean, looking into the hospitals and disability system in Russia is truly depressing. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting case that that there is obvious disconnect between protection of Russians and what they're doing, and it doesn't seem to hold. On your second point about the overall support, I spent so much time thinking about this, and actually there's a recent article in the New Yorker that interviews people in Russia, kind of ethnographic / focus groupy type of thing, where they try to understand why people support the war. They kind of come down to saying they might disagree, but they're not saying anything about it for a variety of reasons. I think that if you look at a lot of countries, including this country, you know, we have a president that talks about mass deportation, and we have a population that is majority support in terms of mass deportation. So now, are people really going to support that when if it actually happened? I'm not sure. But I mean, that's I think a difficult thing to discern how many people actually support a policy like that versus just haven't really given it a lot of thought and think something along the lines is okay. And I think it's combined in Russia with the problem of being doing surveys. I mean, I personally don't know who would answer a survey in Russia. Like, why in the world would you, even if you, whatever thoughts you had, why wouldn't you just be quiet about it? Why answer any survey? So I'm skeptical in that sense, but I think that this far into the war, we cannot say there is not evidence that a lot of Russians are at a minimum willing to go along with the war. You know, like we could have had doubts before. There's probably a smaller percent of core supporters, really super supporters, but there is a lot of people that are willing to go along with it. And I think that's really hard to disagree with.
Okay, so we're gonna have to do a lightning round. This gentleman, I'm gonna group some questions. So if we can keep the questions and answers a little bit shorter, then you'll get the benefit of everybody's input. So I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Go ahead.
Hello and greetings to all. I am Deepen, PhD in finance and from Stanford University, Nepal. I am here in Stanford for a short winter course, and I am thankful for the opportunity being here. Thank you, Professor Yoshiko, for a great insight you shared. It's really enlightened me and hope that everyone same here. I just have two questions. Sorry, not two questions, actually two queries, as earlier said.
Okay, as fast as possible.
Yes. In addition to Russian imperial ambition, how do you think Putin's view of Ukraine is part of Russia's historical identity in influence the decision of invading Ukraine? And then my second is, apart from the imperial and national identity factors, which you have put much emphasis that works as independent variable and dependent variable, how important was the role of Western influence and NATO's eastward expansion in motivating Russia's actions?
Okay, great. Okay, before you answer that, Ken Schultz is next.
So not about the war itself, a broader question about identity and conflict. I wonder if there's something of a conflict bias in a lot of this analysis that kind of sees identity as pushing in the direction of boundaries between people, trust, it creates competition, all those things. But what about the peaceful side of, like, could we think about, for example, there's the work on kind of German and Japanese post-war identities, thinking about starting militarism, becoming more pacifist, if you will, or countries that have intentionally tried to create multi-ethnic identities that to try to dampen any kind of conflict. So I feel like that was kind of a missing that kind of the identities whose content is such that they push it.
Okay, before you answer that, you may take some notes.
Okay.
Okay, you may need to. Margaret, and then Iveta, and then Dawn.
Margaret Levy, Senior Fellow here at CBDO. So I'm sort of the different side of Ken's question, which is that I'm interested in how Ukraine itself creates its sustains an army, to what extent it uses identity, and the sort of strategic use of identity in this regard. So one piece of that is, of course, trying to create a national identity as a position for Russia. But I'm also interested in the extent to which there's the mobilization of very weak identities. So often in wars, you use soccer clubs or, something young men will mobilize around the bar rather than some kind of strong ethnic, religious, or racial.
Okay, so, okay, I'll just make the strategic choice. Iveta and then Dawn as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I've been to many discussions like that, and I think the recurring topic is whether or not this identity is organic. This is something that Russians just have and Putin give them, or vice versa. And my question is, do you think these kind of discussions are important at all as an identity scholar, whether it's organic or not? And can we talk about organic identities in highly repressive regimes like that at all?
Okay, and Don Emerson, very quickly.
Don Emerson, Senior Fellow Emeritus. The elephant in this room is named Donald Trump. It seems to me we're at a fork in the road between, yes, identity matters. Then, of course, the puzzle is, why haven't the Russian people realized what's happening, their identity, et cetera, right? How can they fight on behalf of us? of imperial identity, which is still so abstract. Incidentally, it's possible that what happens in a place like Greenland or a place like Panama could generate increasing attention to the very concept of imperial identity. But I won't go down that road. I'll simply suggest that with Donald Trump, and presumably Putin is looking at Trump and hoping that Trump will in fact generate some kind of diplomacy that will allow at least to escape, unfortunately, the intellectual question of whether identity matters or not.
Okay.
In that sense, perhaps we're being overtaken by it.
Okay.
So you can answer some, none, or all of that.
Okay, let me just pick a couple of things. I think on the potential conflict bias and identity, I think that's a very good point that we could just be looking at all the cases where identity leads to something. But as I mentioned in terms of how identity changes post-conflict, I think there's work on the creation of these cross-cutting cleavages and things like that post-wars. And I think the creation of different identities in Germany and Japan is actually interesting and has probably more to do with the political factors, because Germany really only started apologizing under the SPD. So a lot of people think the war ended and they were sorry. No, they didn't really they didn't really apologize till much later. And a lot of the memorialization, et cetera, of the Holocaust and all that happened under later governments. So I think that there's clearly a case there for government and political parties, et cetera, in the creation of different kind of identities, but also the defeat. I mean, people have argued what Russia really needs is a massive defeat to defeat Putinism in order to create something new. And without that, it will be hard to change. On Margaret's question about the creation and sustaining military, I think the question of mobilization in Ukraine is very interesting, because if everybody's so eager, why are they having trouble increasing the number of volunteers in their army? And some people really believe this is what they absolutely need to do. I think there's a lot of interesting strategic choices going on. If people I've talked to in Ukraine are convinced the war will go on for a long time. They're convinced that they are going to be called up. So they're not moving out of the country, but they're saying like, well, I'm not going to hasten my death by a couple of years. I'll wait till I'm called up. So I think there's some of that. It's also politically difficult for a government in wartime to do something that they know is probably pretty unpopular. And in the context of not having elections, et cetera, I think it's a delicate balance for the government to be able to manage that. I think it would be much easier to manage the mobilization if they had very strong commitment by Western partners to give them the equipment, et cetera. They could say, like, we're not just doing what the Russians are doing, which is using young people as cannon fodder. It would be easier to mobilize people if they knew they had the resources they need. So I think it's a good question for not just the current war, but even in the post-war settlement, like how they're going to maintain the army in that condition.
Okay, so probably final 30 seconds.
I think on the Trump thing, we just don't know. We don't know. Trump has been an unreliable partner to everyone. And he has said rhetorically how much he loves Putin and Kim Jong-un and other dictators. But in terms of actually delivering, he signed the 2014 sanctions into law, which were put in place by Congress because they did not trust him to not get rid of them on his own. Now, if he was really pro-Russian, he would have not signed them. He tried to get Ukraine, he tried to, as we know, hold up military assistance to Ukraine for electoral gain, but in the end, it went through. So he's unreliable, and so we don't know, actually, I think, what will happen. I guess we can just hope for the best.
All right. And on that happy, hopeful note, thank you very much, Zoe.